So when we think of the default song structure probably in most of our minds, if not all of our minds, is verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. And then most of the alterations to that, we might be thinking of things like pre-choruses. So we would have verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and then bridge, chorus. Or we might think about post choruses, and most often, if you have a post chorus, usually you have a pre chorus as well. It doesn't have to be that way, but it seems to happen fairly often that way. So then you would have verse, pre chorus, chorus, and very often you save the post chorus for the second chorus. So we'd go back to verse, this time verse two, pre chorus, chorus, post chorus, and then sometimes the post chorus just goes back to the chorus, and then that goes back to the post chorus. Or sometimes, again, you'll have a bridge and then a chorus and a post chorus again to finish out the song. But something that is very subtle and different and really isn't an uncommon thing to do, but I think as songwriters, sometimes people just don't think about it as much as you would think, is having a third verse that happens after the bridge. And this is something that Vertical Horizon does, I think, more often than not, especially with their earlier albums. And this can be a great way to change how we develop out our story. So, if you take the chorus out for a second and just look at the song structure without the chorus, that's usually a good way to break down how the story is being told, because the story is usually something that is very theme driven. In this case, it's not really adding to the story, right? We're talking about um, we'll start with he. That's what most of the courses are. He's everything you want. He's everything you need. He's everything inside of you that you wish you could be. He says all the right things at exactly the right time, but he means nothing to you and you don't know why. So that's covering that main theme. It's not really a story element. The story is contained largely in the verses and the bridge. So with your average song structure and you take out the chorus, you're left with essentially verse, verse, bridge. So that gives you sort of a three-act structure. You have your first act, whatever happens first. Then you have your second verse, which is maybe what happens next. And of course, your story doesn't have to be structured that way in a song. Sometimes you start with the present, and then the second verse, you go to the past to figure out how did we get here. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. But you have three parts to your story, and the climax of your story is usually going to be in your bridge because your bridge is going to be a huge musical change up. It's usually higher energy than your verses are going to be. If you think about the energy in your song, on average, chorus is going to be highest energy 99 times out of 100, or hopefully at least 90 times out of 100. The chorus should be the musical highlight of your song. And then the bridge is very often the second most compared to the verse, which is usually going to be the lowest energy of the main song sections. So, thinking of it that way, it makes sense that the climax of a story is usually towards the end of the story. And also, the climax is, when you think of the climax musically, that's going to be the chorus. Climax is the biggest part. So, the biggest climax of your song musically that is not your chorus is the bridge. And the bridge is the last of the song sections you would have with verse, chorus, bridge, chorus that is actually story driven or not just about the theme. And of course, there are exceptions to this. It's not always going to be this way, but very often the bridge and verses are kind of working together more on the story side. When you add that third verse after the bridge, this allows you to have a different three-act structure or a different way of looking at the three-act structure if you are going to have a sort of three-act structure type story unfold. This gives you the opportunity to have the climax of the story in the bridge and then to have either an epilogue or the conclusion of the story in a verse that comes after it. So if you think of, three act structure and how plots tend to develop, there is sort of this, inciting incident and then the rising action, which would be the second part, second verse in this case, and then the climax and then the conclusion. And the climax and the conclusion are both in the third act. So before, the bridge would have had to handle essentially the entire third act of our song. We have to have both the climax of the story, and we also have to conclude the story. But now, in this sort of song structure that we have in Everything You Want and in many other songs that we can use, is one where we can separate that third act out and let the bridge just concentrate on being the climax of the story, and then conclude the story or have an epilogue to the end of the story in that third verse. So let's look at how it develops in Everything You Want. We're just going to read through the lyrics, taking out the chorus, because again, taking out the chorus is often a very good way to look sort of just at the story level of a song. So the first verse, which is a doubly long verse, so you could see it as the first verse is essentially really verse one and verse two, but really it's just twice as long first verse. Somewhere they're speaking, it's already coming in. Oh, and it's rising at the back of your mind. You never could get it unless you were fed it. Now you're here and you don't know why. But under skin knees and the skid marks, past the places where you used to learn, you howl and listen and wait for the echoes of angels who won't return. So we could spend an hour just trying to analyze that. But I think at a very high level, essentially, we're covering this person is sort of, waking up and they're in a rough place. They have, the skid marks and they have skin knees and, there's howling going on and you're listening and waiting for the echoes of angels who won't return. So you're crying out to the ether and nothing is coming back. There's no call back. So essentially, the girl that this is talking to is in a rough place, right? Super high level, but that's the first verse, being in a rough place. Verse two, you're waiting for someone to put you together. You're waiting for someone to push you away. There's always another wound to discover. There's always something more you wish he'd say. So now we moved on to, okay, here's what you're looking for. You're waiting for someone to put you together. And yet, in tension with you're waiting for someone to push you away. Um, And then there's always another wound to discover. So, you could keep obsessing over these wounds that you already have, the skin knees and the skid marks and you shouting out into the ether and the echoes of angels that don't return. So we could keep obsessing over this traumatic past or negative past experiences. And there's always something more you wish he'd say. So it's already we've already had the chorus talking about everything you want, but there's that element of, even though that person's perfect in quotation marks, there's always something more. Just you just always want something a little bit more. So this is, not super story driven, but essentially in seeing this sort of as a three act structure, that's where really the rising action is starting to happen. We have the initial setup, which is someone who has all this bad stuff that's happened to them. They're in a rough place. There's nobody there for them, or at least none of the people that used to be there for them theoretically are there for them. You howl and listen and wait for the echoes of angels who won't return in that first verse, and then the second verse, we're really setting up this, and now you're waiting for something that's already here, right? Because there's always something more you wish he'd say. So it's really getting into the meat of this. I'm everything you want. I'm everything you need. Then we have the bridge, which is essentially the climax of this very mini story we have. But you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. So it's sort of this bitter, desperate cry of like, just what are you waiting for? I'm everything you want. We already covered that part. I'm everything you need. And you're just waiting and you're looking for love everywhere but where it already is. I already love you and you refuse to accept that, even though I seem to be everything you want and everything you need. But you're just gonna sit tight and watch it all unwind. It's what you're asking for. That's what you seem to want based on your actions, or in this case, inaction, perhaps. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. So this is essentially the point in the story where you could imagine that you're actually saying this to the person, like, what, you're shaking them, like, what more do you want? I don't understand. How do you not see this? What more can I do? But it's not the conclusion to the story, right? And certainly the song could just go back into the chorus and call it a day. But instead, it goes straight into the third verse, which kind of concludes the story. Out of the island, into the highway, past the places where you might have turned, right? Past the choices you could have made, all these opportunities where you maybe could have chose me. You never did notice, but you still hide away the anger of angels who won't return. So, connecting back to that first verse, where in the first verse it's listen and wait for the echoes of angels who won't return. And now it's you never did notice, but you still hide away the anger of angels who won't return. So, sort of concluding the song with the idea that it's over. You're just really not going to choose me. And of course, this is right before we get into the last time of he's everything you want. And then finally, I am everything you want. I am everything you need. So this allows us to have this sort of epilogue or this sort of conclusion to the story, really concluding that, nothing's going to change here because she's coming out of the island onto the highway past the places where you might have turned, right? So she's not taking the turns. She's choosing to keep going. And um so so it the third verse gives you this nice opportunity to have a conclusion, which even if you think of a chart, if you've ever seen the chart of how a story develops, the climax is the high point. And then in the third act, it actually at the very end of the movie or book or whatever has this three act structure, the excitement, if you will, comes down, right? After you beat the villain, you then conclude the story, right? The end of the first Spider-Man movie isn't like, oh, Green Goblin's gone, and now it's all right, the end of the movie. Like, no. Then we gotta conclude some stuff. We have Peter Parker saying, sorry, MJ, I can't because I'm a hero. He doesn't say that, but essentially. Uh, and no superhero film ever or any movie just like ends on the climactic fight, right? There's always a conclusion after that's less high energy that sort of wraps up the story element. And when we have a third verse that comes after the bridge, that gives us this opportunity. So essentially, next time you're writing a song, something to consider is depending on the story you're trying to tell, if you feel like your bridge is trying to do too much story wise, because you essentially have your entire third act. And of course, when we talk about third acts, this is a song, right? There's like 200 words total. So it's going to be like this, right? There's not that much story going on. There's only so much story you can tell in 200 words. But if you think of it as a super micro story, think about, is my bridge doing too much? Because then maybe it makes sense to have a third verse after the bridge and make it so that the bridge is not handling essentially our entire third act, where it has the job of both concluding the story and being the climax of the story. Instead, you can split it up, have the climax of the story be with the bridge, which will fit well with the music of the bridge, likely. And then the third verse can conclude the story. Hey friend, if you found this video helpful, something else you'll likely find helpful is my ultimate song sections cheat sheet. If you've struggled to understand song sections or want some central principles that will help you to write better choruses, verses, bridges, and more, then be sure to check it out at songwritertheory.com/songsections.